The red on-air light glowed like a quiet warning above the studio doors. Inside, everything was running exactly as planned. Every cue was timed. Every joke had been rehearsed. Every segment had been approved hours earlier. The audience clapped on command, laughed on cue, and waited for the familiar rhythm of another late-night broadcast to unfold the way it always did. Johnny Carson sat behind his desk, flipping a pen between his fingers while the band finished the opening tune. From the outside, he looked accomplished, effortless, fully in control. But inside, his mind was already moving ahead, pacing through the night's structure. He knew the order. He knew the guests. He knew the jokes that would land and the ones that would barely skim the surface. It was a machine that had run smoothly for years. Nothing was supposed to interrupt it. Behind the cameras, stagehands moved with practiced silence. Producers checked clipboards. Assistants whispered last-minute reminders. The show had rules unwritten but ironclad. No surprises. No unscheduled guests. No broken flow. Live television demanded control, and control was something Johnny valued deeply. Even if he rarely admitted it out loud, then someone stood in the hallway. Dean Martin didn't announce himself. He didn't demand entry. He didn't ask for special treatment. He simply stood there, hands in his pockets, wearing that familiar calm expression, half amused, half distant, like a man who had learned long ago not to hurry for anyone. A billed production assistant noticed him first. She froze. At first she thought she was mistaken. Late nights blurred faces. Legends became myths when seen too often on screens. But this was no illusion. The posture, the eyes, the quiet confidence that didn't need permission to exist, she swallowed. "Sir, are you?" Dean smiled, gentle and tired at the same time. "I think I'm in the right place," he said. She didn't know what to do. There was no protocol for this, no form. No checklist titled "What to Do When a Legend Appears Uninvited." She excused herself and hurried down the hall. Within seconds, the control room felt different. A producer leaned forward. Another removed his headset. Someone whispered a name barely loud enough to be heard, but heavy enough to shift the air. Dean Martin. The name carried weight. Not just fame, but history. Decades of laughter. Songs that felt like memories, even when you hadn't lived them. A public image that made people assume ease. Alcohol, jokes, and charm, but never the quieter truths underneath. Johnny Carson didn't know yet. He was delivering a line that earned polite laughter. He nodded, smiled, moved on. The show rolled forward. Backstage, the head producer made a decision that could end a career if it went wrong. He walked toward Dean. "Mr. Martin," said carefully. "You're not scheduled tonight," Dean nodded. "I know." There was no attitude in his voice. No challenge. "Just honesty. We're live," the producer added. Dean glanced toward the studio doors. The laughter seeped through the walls like a memory from another life. "I won't cause trouble," Dean said. "If Johnny doesn't want me out there, I'll leave." That sentence, "I'll leave," hung in the air longer than anyone expected. The producer hesitated. This wasn't a drunk cameo. This wasn't a publicity stunt. There was something restrained about the way Dean stood there, as if he were carrying a reason heavier than pride. The producer turned and whispered into his headset. "Johnny, there's someone here." Carson raised an eyebrow slightly, never breaking his smile, unless it's the president. "It can wait," he murmured. The producer swallowed. "It's Dean." The pen stopped spinning. For a fraction of a second so brief, the cameras didn't catch it, Johnny Carson's expression changed. Not shock, not anger. Something closer to uncertainty. Dean Martin wasn't just another celebrity. He was history. He was also someone Johnny hadn't spoken to in a long time. The audience laughed again. Unaware of the quiet tension building just beyond the stage lights, Johnny cleared his throat and leaned back in his chair, buying himself time. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said casually, "we'll be right back after this short break." Applause filled the room. The red light dimmed. As soon as the cameras paused, Johnny stood. "Where is he?" he asked. Backstage, Dean waited alone. When Johnny stepped into the hallway, the noise of the studio faded behind him. The two men looked at each other for a moment that felt longer than it was. No words, no greeting. Just recognition. They had both aged. Dean's hair was lighter now. Johnny's face carried sharper lines. Fame had treated them differently. But time had been equally honest with both. "Well," Johnny said finally, trying for humor, "this is a surprise." Dean smiled faintly. "I figured you might say that." There was an awkward pause. Not hostile, not warm. Just unfinished. Johnny crossed his arms. "You could have called?" Dean nodded again. "I know." That was it. No excuse, no defense. Johnny studied him more closely now. Not the public image. "The man, you okay?" Johnny asked, quieter. Dean exhaled through his nose, the way people do when they don't want to lie but don't want to explain either. "I had a long night," he said. "Thought I'd come see an old friend." Johnny looked toward the studio doors, then back at Dean. "You understand what you're asking?" Johnny said. Dean met his eyes. "I'm not asking," he said gently. "If it's a no, it's a no." Now, the honesty disarmed him. Johnny sighed. "You always did this," he muttered. Dean chuckled softly. "And you always hated it." Another beat. Johnny shook his head. "Half smiling now?" "Get ready," he said. "You're coming out." Dean blinked. "You sure?" Johnny looked at him. "No," he said honestly. "But let's find out." The red light came back on. The band began to play. The audience clapped. Expecting the next planned segment, Johnny returned to his desk, adjusted his tie, and leaned toward the microphone. "Folks," he said, "television is usually very predictable," light laughter, "but every now and then, it surprises even us." A murmur rippled through the crowd. "There's someone here tonight," Johnny continued, choosing his words carefully, "who didn't plan to be on this show." The band slowed, and frankly, neither did we. The audience leaned forward. Johnny turned slightly. "Ladies and gentlemen, Dean Martin." For a split second, the room was silent. Then it exploded. Applause thundered through the studio. People stood. Some gasped. Some laughed in disbelief. Cameras scrambled to adjust. Dean Martin stepped onto the stage, calm as ever, lifting a hand in a small wave that somehow felt more powerful than a grand gesture. He took a seat across from Johnny. The applause continued. Johnny waited for it to settle, then looked at him. "So," he said, "care to tell everyone why you showed up uninvited?" Dean leaned back slightly, folded his hands, and smiled not the showman's smile.
With something quieter.
"Because sometimes," he said, "you don't realize how much time has passed until you feel it." The room went still. Johnny didn't interrupt. "And when you feel it," Dean continued, "you either ignore it or you do something about it." Johnny nodded slowly. The audience wasn't laughing now. They were listening, and somewhere between the stage, lights in the silence, something unexpected was beginning. Not a performance, not a stunt, but a moment that would unfold in ways no one in that room could yet imagine. The applause eventually faded, but the silence that followed was heavier than the noise that came before it. Dean Martin sat calmly in his chair, one leg crossed over the other, hands resting loosely as if he had all the time in the world. Yet beneath that relaxed posture, there was something different tonight, something restrained, almost careful. This was not the man audiences were used to seeing, not the effortless charmer, not the punchline, not the myth. Johnny Carson noticed it immediately. He leaned back slightly, eyes narrowing not in suspicion but in attention. Johnny had spent a lifetime reading people. He could sense when a guest was hiding behind humor, when a story was rehearsed, when a laugh was a shield. And right now, Dean wasn't hiding. That unsettled him. "So," Johnny said at last, breaking the quiet, "you show up unannounced, interrupt my nice, orderly evening, and then say something that makes half the audience forget to breathe." Light laughter rippled through the studio, but it didn't last. Dean smiled politely. "I didn't come to steal the show," he said. I came because I didn't want to steal another night from myself. Johnny blinked. That wasn't a line. That wasn't a joke. That sounds serious, Johnny said. Dean nodded once. It is. The band sat motionless. The studio crew stopped shifting. Even the audience, trained by years of television rhythm, sensed this wasn't the moment to clap or laugh. Something rare was happening, something unplanned, unscripted. And fragile, Johnny cleared his throat. You've never been one for seriousness, he said gently. People expect you to smile, sing, make it look easy. Dean's eyes flickered for a moment, not to the audience, but somewhere far behind them. That's what they saw, he replied. Not always what it was. Johnny leaned forward slightly now, elbows on the desk. You know, he said, people still argue about you, about what was real, about what was an act. Dean chuckled softly. They always will. Then he paused. But here's the truth, he continued, voice quieter now. When people decide who you are, they stop asking how you are. The sentence landed hard. Johnny didn't speak. Dean inhaled slowly, as if choosing each word with care. For a long time, he said, I didn't mind that. It was easier to let them believe what they wanted. Expectations are comfortable. You can hide inside them. Johnny nodded slowly, but Dean added, comfort has a way of turning into distance. And distance has a way of turning into regret. A hush fell over the room. Somewhere in the audience, someone shifted in their seat. Another wiped their eyes without realizing why. Johnny felt a strange tightness in his chest. He'd interviewed presidents, comedians, icons. He'd heard confessions, masked as jokes and truths hidden in laughter. But this felt exposed in a way television rarely allowed. You're talking about something specific, Johnny said. Dean looked at him. I am. The two men locked eyes, not as host and guest, but as two people who had lived long enough to understand what was being left unsaid. Johnny hesitated. Is this about stepping back? He asked. Dean shook his head. No, he said. It's about stepping in before it's too late. The phrase echoed. Johnny swallowed. For what? He asked quietly. Dean didn't answer immediately. Instead, glanced toward the audience, then back at Johnny. Have you ever noticed, he said, how applause fades faster the older you get? Johnny smiled faintly. Comes with the territory. Dean nodded, but silence doesn't, he said. Silence gets louder. The words hung in the air. Johnny leaned back again, this time slower. You didn't just wander in here tonight, he said. You came with something on your mind. Dean exhaled. Yes. And Johnny pressed. And I almost didn't come, Dean admitted. I stood outside for a while. Thought about leaving. Johnny raised an eyebrow. That would have been a first, he said lightly. Dean smiled. But it didn't reach his eyes. I've left a lot of places without saying what I should have said, he replied. I didn't want tonight to be another one. A murmur ran through the crowd. Johnny felt it, then the shift. This wasn't entertainment anymore. This was a reckoning unfolding under studio lights. You're making me nervous, Johnny said, half joking, half honest. Dean nodded. Me too. They shared a brief, quiet laugh, but it was brittle. Johnny straightened. You know, he said, people think this chair gives me control. That I decide how conversations go. Dean looked at him knowingly. But tonight, Johnny continued, you've got everyone leaning forward, including me. Dean folded his hands again. I didn't plan to say this on television, he said. But I also didn't plan to feel this. Urgency. The word cut through the room. Urgency. Johnny echoed. Dean nodded slowly. When you spend your life being the strong one, he said, you don't notice how tired you are until you stop moving. Johnny felt a chill. And when you finally stop, Dean continued, you realize there are things you never said to people who mattered. Johnny's voice softened. Is one of those people sitting here? Dean met his gaze. Yes. The audience gasped, not loudly. But collectively, Johnny felt his heart pound. For the record, he said carefully, this is where I usually make a joke. Dean smiled. I know. Johnny didn't joke. He waited. Dean took a breath. There was a time, he said, when I believed friendships didn't need maintenance, that time and success would hold them together. Johnny nodded faintly. I was wrong, Dean said. Silence doesn't preserve anything. It just erodes it. Johnny's throat tightened. You're talking about us, he said. Dean didn't look away. Yes. The studio was completely still now. Cameras rolled, but no one moved. Producers forgot to signal. The band members stared at their instruments. Johnny took a slow breath. You disappeared, he said quietly. Not just from the show. From people. Dean nodded. I did. Why? Johnny asked. Dean hesitated because it was easier to be absent, he said, than to admit I didn't know how to be present anymore. Johnny closed his eyes briefly. That answer struck deeper than he expected. And tonight? Johnny asked. Tonight, Dean said, voice steady but low. I didn't want to disappear again. Looked at him for a long moment, then he said something no one expected. Then don't. The words were simple. They changed everything. Dean's expression cracked, not dramatically. Not visibly, but enough that Johnny saw it. Enough that the audience felt it. For the first time that night, Dean Martin looked vulnerable, and for the first time in years, Johnny Carson wasn't hosting, he was listening. The silence returned, thick, electric, unresolved. And everyone in that room understood one thing. Whatever Dean had come to say, he hadn't said it yet. The silence did not break on its own. It pressed inward. Johnny Carson felt it before he understood it. This was the kind of silence that didn't belong to television. It belonged to hospital rooms, empty houses, and late nights when applause no longer reached you. The audience wasn't restless. They weren't uncomfortable. They were still because something honest was unfolding, and honesty demanded attention. Johnny rested his hands on the desk, grounding himself. You know, he said slowly, people think distance happens because of ego or success or pride. Dean Martin nodded faintly. They rarely think it happens because of fear. The word hung between them. Dean looked down at his hands for the first time since walking on stage. Yes, he said. Fear. Johnny waited. When you spend decades being strong for everyone else, Dean continued, you forget how to be honest about weakness. Start believing people only want the version of you that never cracks. Johnny swallowed.
Damn.
And when that belief sets in, Dean added, you disappear not because you don't care, because you care too much to disappoint. The audience felt it then. This wasn't nostalgia. This wasn't reflection. This was confession. Johnny leaned back slightly, his voice quieter now. I always thought you left because you wanted freedom, he said. You had options. You could walk away from anything. Dean smiled sadly. That's what it looked like. But, Johnny asked, but freedom isn't the same as peace, Dean replied. And walking away doesn't mean you aren't carrying everything with you. The cameras stayed close now, not because a producer told them to, but because instinct demanded it. Johnny nodded slowly. I didn't call either, he admitted. That admission rippled through the room. Dean looked up. You could have, Dean said. I know, Johnny replied. I told myself you were fine, that you didn't need anyone checking in. Dean exhaled. That's the lie we tell about strong people, he said. That they don't need help? Johnny's eyes darkened slightly. You know, he said, this show made me feel present, busy, surrounded. But when the lights went off, it was quieter than people imagine. Dean listened closely now. When it's quiet, Johnny continued, you start to realize how many conversations you postponed, how many calls you didn't return, how many friends you assumed would always be there. Dean nodded. Assumptions are dangerous, he said softly. They convince us time is generous. Johnny felt the weight of that. Is that what tonight is about? He asked. Time. Dean hesitated. No, he said. It's about something I lost while I still had time. The audience leaned forward again. Johnny didn't interrupt. For years, Dean continued, I let the world decide who I was. The drinker, the joker, the guy who never took anything seriously. Johnny nodded faintly. But there were nights, Dean said, voice tightening just slightly, When I went home and sat alone because I didn't know how to be anything else, Johnny's jaw tightened. And when people stopped seeing you, Dean continued, you stopped correcting them. Eventually even friends stopped asking. Johnny stared at the desk for a moment, then back at Dean. I didn't know, he said quietly. Dean met his eyes. Yes. That's the part that hurts the most, he said. Not that people judge, but that they stop being curious. The audience was utterly silent now. Johnny felt a familiar sting behind his eyes, the kind he usually masked with humor. So why now? Johnny asked. Why tonight? Dean inhaled deeply. Because I had a moment recently, he said. A moment that made everything else feel small. Johnny waited. I realized, Dean said, that if I left this world tomorrow, most people would remember the character, not the man. Johnny felt his chest tighten. And I realized something else, Dean added. There were people who once knew the man, and I let them drift away. Johnny's voice was barely audible now. You're not gone, he said. Dean smiled faintly. But I almost was, he replied. That sentence changed the air. Johnny sat up straighter. What do you mean? He asked. Dean paused long enough that the audience felt the tension rise. There was a night, Dean said slowly, not long ago, when I asked myself if anyone would notice if I stayed quiet forever. Johnny's breath caught, and he asked, and I didn't like the answer, Dean said. A collective gasp moved through the studio. Johnny shook his head. You should have told someone, he said. Dean nodded. Should have. Johnny's voice hardened not with anger, but with resolve. You don't have to disappear to rest, he said. You don't have to vanish to matter. Dean looked at him, eyes glistening, not broken, but honest. That's why I came, he said. Not to perform, not to relive the past. Johnny leaned forward. Then why? He asked. Dean held his gaze. To say something out loud. Well, I still can. The tension surged. Johnny nodded slowly. Then say it, he said. Dean took a breath. And for the first time since walking onto that stage, he looked directly at the audience. Not as strangers, but as witnesses. I spent years thinking silence protected me, Dean said. But silence doesn't protect. It isolates. Johnny listened, unmoving. Isolation, Dean continued, is far more dangerous than honesty. He turned back to Johnny. I don't want to leave things unsaid anymore, he said. Not with you, not with anyone. Johnny felt the full weight of the moment settle in his chest. Neither do I, he replied. The band remained silent. The red light glowed. Millions watched at home, unaware they were witnessing something that would never be planned again, because the most powerful moments on television are never produced. They are revealed. And Dean Martin had not yet revealed the most important truth of the night. The silence did not rush him. It waited. Dean Martin sat still, shoulders relaxed, but chest rising more slowly now, as if the weight he had carried for years was finally being set down carefully, deliberately. Across from him, Johnny Carson did not speak. He had learned long ago that the most important moments were ruined by haste. The audience held its breath. Dean looked at Johnny, not the host, not the legend, but the man who had once laughed with him off camera, who had understood the pauses as much as the punchlines. Came tonight, Dean said softly, because I didn't want the last thing between us to be distance. Johnny's eyes did not leave his. For years, Dean continued, I told myself I'd explain one day, that there would be a better moment, a quieter one. But moments don't wait, they pass. Johnny nodded once. And when they pass, Dean said, all you're left with is what you didn't say. He paused. The studio lights hummed faintly. I didn't come to apologize, Dean said. And I didn't come to make peace with the audience. Johnny leaned forward slightly. I came to make peace with myself, Dean said, and with you because you mattered more than I ever admitted. Johnny swallowed. You mattered to me too, he said, voice low. Dean smiled not with relief, but with recognition. I know, he said. That's what makes silence so heavy. It grows between people who care. Johnny rested his hands on the desk. You once told me, Johnny said, that if you stayed too long in one place, people would expect something from you. Dean chuckled quietly. I said a lot of things to avoid expectations, he replied. And, Johnny asked. Now I understand, Dean said. that expectations aren't burdens when they come from respect. Johnny nodded. The audience sensed the closing of something, not an ending, but a completion.
Oh.
I spent too much time protecting an image, Dean continued, the easy smile, the effortless laugh. I thought if I let it crack, everything else would collapse. Johnny shook his head. It didn't, he said. No, Dean agreed. It didn't, but it cost me time. He looked out at the audience now, people of all ages, many of whom had grown up watching both men. If there's one thing I've learned, Dean said, it's that kindness doesn't require strength, it requires courage. Johnny smiled faintly. And courage, Dean added, is admitting when you've been quiet for too long. Johnny took a breath. No, he said, this show has hosted a lot of surprises. But this isn't one of them. Dean raised an eyebrow. No, he asked. Johnny shook his head. This is what happens when people finally stop performing, he said. Start telling the truth. The audience erupted not in laughter, not in cheers, but in applause that felt different. Slower, deeper, sustained. Dean stood not to bow, not to soak it in, but simply because it felt right. Johnny stood too. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Johnny did something he rarely did on air. He stepped around the desk and extended his hand. Dean took it. The handshake was firm, steady, unremarkable to the camera, but everything to the moment. Johnny turned back to the audience. Ladies and gentlemen, he said, voice composed but warm, tonight wasn't about entertainment. The applause softened. It was about remembering that even people you think have everything still need connection. Dean nodded beside him. Johnny placed a hand on Dean's shoulder. And sometimes, Johnny continued, the bravest thing a person can do is show up. The band began to play out a loud theme, not a triumphant close, but something gentle, restrained. Dean leaned toward the microphone one last time. Don't wait, he said simply. That was it. No slogan, no flourish. Just truth. The cameras faded, the red light dimmed. And somewhere between the applause and the quiet that followed, millions of people felt something settle inside them. A reminder that kindness isn't loud, resilience isn't flashy, and the most powerful moments are often the ones that arrive uninvited, not to perform, but to heal.